I'm not a hero, and I hate when people say that, right? I didn't do this to be praised. I didn't do this, for any kind of praise or anything like that. I did this because my blood is not more important than those children's bloods in Gaza. And just because I have a blue passport that says Australian on it doesn't mean that I'm more worthy of living than those children.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Doctor, it's so nice to have you back. I think we had you in October 2024.
Yep.
And you had recently returned, or it might have been after some time, you had returned from your first deployment in Gaza. And now you've just returned again.
Yep. I was there this time for just over a month in Gaza. I was stationed in the north, and I was also stationed in the south as well. So I was kind of everywhere in Gaza this time.
In this recent
measures.
Yeah. Okay.
And I arrived during the ceasefire.
Okay.
And I was there when the ceasefire broke.
Okay.
And I left, while the war was still raging on.
Wow. You left just how long ago?
I left about 5 days ago.
Okay. And how was there a stark difference between your first time that you were there and the second time?
So, there were some days when we were working this time around where we weren't actually that busy.
Okay.
And the reason why we weren't that busy was because everyone that arrived to the emergency department was dead.
Wow.
There was nobody to work on.
So this is after the ceasefire had the relentless bombing started.
Well, the ferocity of these bombs this time around wasn't like anything that we'd experienced during the height of the war in June last year. A lot of people were arriving, not just dead, but completely mutilated, burnt to a crisp, organs fused together, multiple bodies burnt into a crisp, fused together. This was very different to anything that we'd ever seen before. So some days when we were working in the emergency department, there actually wasn't much work to do because everyone that was there was dead. And that was something that was very different. And I think you've seen images of the ferocity of the bombs this time around, where people are flying 300 meters in the air, 200-300 meters in the air. It's a very different, there's no food, water, electricity, no aid trucks getting in, people are starving, the bombs are bigger, seems to be now less and less protection for hospitals, for aid workers. When we were there, we had the UN aid workers' safe house was bombed, and the international UN workers were killed. We also had the paramedics, the Gazan paramedics, who were executed and buried.
Well, that was recently on the news. Some of them were found bounded.
Yep, with multiple gunshot wounds, and their ambulances were also buried as well.
And there was video footage.
So the video footage showed, because initially the Israeli army had denied that they even knew anything about it. Then when a body was found, then they said that when a body was found, they said that they were very suspicious. They didn't have the lights on or anything like that. And they approached the soldiers very suspiciously, and the soldiers were scared. Then they found a mobile phone on one of the bodies of the victims, and the mobile phone obviously contradicted that entire story.
Yes.
And now there's been an investigation.
By who?
Well,
really, there's hasn't been much accountability during this whole crisis. I mean, blatant war crimes seem to have been committed, but as long as you have Western governments and media whitewashing this, we're not seeing the full picture.
Yeah. Well, we're not seeing the full picture because international journalists aren't allowed in. And, even during the ceasefire when I was there, we would have children coming in who were shot in the head by drones. And these weren't, spray firing bullets and one hit them in the head. This was a single gunshot wound.
Target, sniper shots
to the head and neck. We were seeing a lot of children like that. It's very, very difficult. When you see just the volume of children that are being killed in Gaza. I think on average since the ceasefire broke, there's been over 100 a day
Wow.
that have been killed.
So the death toll is possibly much higher than the estimates.
I know the death toll is much higher because
it would be in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, when I was walking, I'd walk to and from the hospital to the safe house and the hospital. And when you walk there, people would point to you and say, that building there's 30 bodies trapped in this building. This family, no one's been able to pull them out of the rubble. There's 15 bodies there. None of these bodies have been counted. And obviously, 80% of the infrastructure has been destroyed. How many bodies are under each one of 8 buildings? There's no heavy machinery to lift those. And obviously there's unexploded ordnance as well, so it's very dangerous as well. So there's, dozens of bodies. Sometimes there's dozens of bodies in a single building that's been destroyed. And there's obviously thousands of these buildings that have been destroyed, and those bodies haven't been counted.
Yes.
So the death toll is definitely much higher.
Because it's a very densely populated area as it is.
Yeah.
Yes. That's very sad. How did you feel with regards to safety? Was your life in danger?
Well, they bombed the hospital when we were in the hospital. They bombed the hospital grounds.
They were targeting certain areas of the hospital?
Well, I can't say what they were targeting, but they definitely killed people. And they killed children. They burnt people alive in their tents around the hospital grounds, and journalists around the hospital. When I was there, they'd bombed the hospitals multiple times, different hospitals, different times. They had also bombed UN safe houses. They had bombed and killed, obviously, those aid workers. There was just nowhere safe. There was nowhere in Gaza that anyone could tell us was safe. The hospitals were not safe, so even if we stayed in the hospital, hospitals were getting bombed. And even if we were staying at the safe houses were also getting bombed as well. So, whether you stayed at the hospital or the safe house, either one of them could be a target. And when you're walking down the street to and from, you could be a drone strike in the area, and you could be collateral damage. The other thing as well was that, when we were there, because the fuel had been shut off, our car, the, NGO car that transports us to and from the hospital, one, it had pretty much run out of petrol, because there's no petrol in Gaza. And two, when the ceasefire broke, they divided the north and the south, and they didn't allow cars to go from north to south or south to north.
Okay.
So they had to leave the car in the north, and we got moved to the south. So when we were in the south, we had no car.
How did you
Walking. I mean, you could go via donkey cart and things like that. The problem is that if you get on a donkey cart and, 10 people jump on the donkey cart with you, one of those people could be wanted.
And you're in danger.
And then that way they could do a drone strike and kill everybody on that donkey cart. And that's just the general consensus. If there's somebody that's wanted,
doesn't matter who.
It doesn't matter who, and it doesn't matter what level, and it doesn't matter if they're militant or political or whatever the reason that they're wanted. That person and whoever is in the vicinity is getting killed. And, if they're in a building, they'll destroy the whole building with everybody, and even if it's filled with women and children. This was just something that was known. And there were many cases where the injured would come in and there would be no men, it would just be women and children. So it was just purely women and children that were. And I think there was a UN report where they had found 35 different cases since the ceasefire broke of just women and children casualties.
Yeah, this is barbaric, to say the least. And to think that how could a country get away with killing women and children, executing children, as you're saying, targeting sniper shots, bombing hospitals, aid workers being killed, journalists being killed. If Russia was to bomb a hospital, you'd hear about it. There would be world headlines in the West. People would be screaming, but it's as if Palestinian blood is not worth anything. That's the message that we've been hearing. I mean, the West has been preaching about human rights, and we've been hearing this for decades. But now when we see this is the time to act, the UN has given countless resolutions, and now we see the West just sitting back and allowing this, normalizing this. This is, this has become a real issue.
Well, I disagree. I think that this has not become normalized. I think to many people, Muslims, non-Muslims, Europeans, non-Europeans, Americans, everywhere around the world, people are disgusted at what they're seeing.
Yes,
they are outraged at what they are seeing, and people are protesting in their millions around the world for this. And actually, I don't think we've ever seen a pro-Palestine movement like we have.
Correct.
Now.
There's changes, no doubt. And you're right. People are very, very disillusioned with what the reaction of the Western governments and politicians. However, the media campaign is trying to normalize this.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. The media campaign is. I mean, when I was there and they bombed. Well, when I just left and they bombed El Ahli Hospital, the BBC reported it as hospital bombed according to Hamas. And I'm like, I'm looking at it, I'm going, it's the IDF have said
the hospital
they bombed the hospital. It's not according to Hamas.
Yeah.
But according to Hamas puts doubt on the headline.
Credibility, yep.
Yeah, and it's framing like this that I think a lot of, people are just sick of, because you can say Hamas said it, but if the IDF also say it, if the UN are saying it, then it's not Hamas saying it. And what it does as well is it's counterproductive, because then it gives legitimacy to Hamas, because then it means that what Hamas said was actually correct.
Yeah.
And we're told that they are the terrorists and they're the bad guys. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't be using them as a reliable source of information. But that's what you're doing. And this is why there's so much conflict within the narrative in the media. And this is why there's so much distrust, because on one hand they'll state one thing, and on the reality is just so obvious. That you can't have a targeted strike on a hospital. That's a war crime.
It is
right.
Definitely.
But this is what we're being told, and when we're on the ground in Gaza, we'll get a message. Not even us, the other NGOs will get a message, or someone will get a message in the vicinity saying it's about to be bombed, and just brace yourself. And we have to act like that's normal, that the hospital that we're in, because someone sent us a text message that it's going to get bombed, that's now normal now. That's how we have to work. Yeah. And it's extremely scary when it does happen, because, we're not, I've grown up in the West. I've not grown up in a war-torn country. I've not grown up with airstrikes. But, for 1 month, I was living under constant airstrikes and bombardment, and the room shaking and windows flying open from just the sheer force of the bombs. The trauma that these kids experience is something that was very real, that I saw this particular time. I remember going onto the wards, and there was a room with a couple of kids that were in there, and it was really hot. So I thought I'd open the window. And when I opened the window, the kid jumped underneath the bed.
Wow.
And, I was like, what's wrong? And the father said to me that what had happened was a drone had gone into the house via the window, and it had thrown a bomb in, and it killed his mother and father and his sibling in front of him. And he had burns to his face, this kid. So he's scared of the drone sounds and the window, because when he hears the drones and if the window's open, he thinks that there's a drone that's going to come in and kill him. And, he can't go anywhere near windows. Like if he sees a window, and this was
traumatized for
this was a 3-year-old child, and there were many children like that were severely traumatized. And, we're talking about 1 million children in Gaza. If they haven't been killed, the level of trauma that they
absolutely
must have.
You would never get over. It would be nearly impossible to get over something like that.
Well, they've not just been traumatized, they've also been malnutritioned for 2 years. So they're all going to have stunted growth. They're all not going to grow normally. They're all going to have mental health issues. And, that's a form of terrorism in itself.
It is. And it's not going to stop terrorism, because when you've seen your mother and father being killed in front of you, what's that going to do to you in the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is not how you create peace. No. You don't create peace by killing. No. You create peace by compromise. Correct. And there doesn't seem to be any compromise. The compromise is, let's have a 2-state solution. No. The compromise is, at least let's feed the children. No. The compromise is let's at least get the polio vaccine, which is exclusively for children. No. The compromise is, well, let's at least allow medical aid to go in so we can treat the wounded that you bomb. The answer is no. So
starvation as a war tactic
Yeah.
is also a war crime.
Well, collective punishment is a war crime, but there's been a lot of collective punishment, from the start. And, when you go in as a doctor and you see the effects of this collective punishment, when you see children who have a relatively minor injury but succumb to that injury and die because of, one, the nutritional status of the child was poor anyway, so they wouldn't survive, anything major. And because of the lack of medical equipment, that's what's killing these people. And if they're not dying from the bombs, they're dying from the lack of medical equipment. And if they're not dying from that, they're dying from the lack of food. And if they're not dying from that, they're dying from all other kinds of issues that are going on in Gaza right now, from the cold. How many children have we seen freeze to death and die, little born babies and stuff? It's wherever you look in Gaza, it is catastrophic.
It is. So, Doctor, when you arrived at the airport, alhamdulillah, there was a large reception waiting for you. And I have footage of you commenting about Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. You're waiting on some reply from them?
In Gaza, the hospitals were bombed while Australian aid workers were there. Our lives were in danger while we were in Gaza. And I'm asking our Prime Minister and Penny Wong to help us, to help the children in Gaza. 2 weeks ago, 1 year ago, we had an Australian aid worker who was killed in Gaza. Our blood is not cheap. We demand that our Prime Minister and Penny Wong help us in order to help those children in Gaza who are dying every single day.
Yeah, so when we were in Gaza, we actually sent out on my organization, we sent out an email saying that we were worried for our safety in Gaza and we needed some assistance. And we reached out to Penny Wong, and there was no reply.
This is while you were in Gaza.
This is while
Australian medical workers in Gaza, in danger, reaching out to the foreign minister and the Australian government. There was no reply.
There was no reply. Now, this is on the backdrop of, a year ago, or just over a year ago, we had another Australian aid worker that was killed. And
what was his name or her?
It was Zoe Franklin. And, she was killed trying to feed children in Gaza. And there hasn't been any consequences to her death from the Australian government. And there was an indifference about us as Australian aid workers in Gaza. There was no support for us while we were out there. There was no checking in. Multiple hospitals were bombed. There wasn't one single point that our government had ever inquired about our safety, even though they knew that we were there.
That's something that we need to follow up. Yeah. The international response has been disappointing. Are there any specific actions that we can take to try and get a response?
Well, the elections are coming up, and the elections here are very tight and very close. And it's not just about Labour and Liberals, it's now about the independents.
Yes.
And it's about whether Labour will win, and if they do win, whether they have a minority government. And if they do, that means that they're going to have to compromise on a lot of things, which means that there will be concessions. And, the Democrats in the United States paid a very heavy price for being complicit in the genocide.
Yes.
I think polls found that was the number one reason people didn't come out and vote for them.
Yes.
It wasn't because of the popularity of the other side.
No, definitely not.
It was more because of the lack of popularity from that side. It didn't galvanize their voter base to come out and support. And this is what's happening now with Labour. There's been so many independents that have broken away, like Senator Fatima.
Yes.
And other independents. And I think they're very worried.
Yes.
And they're very scared.
Yes.
And, when they refuse to speak to Australian aid workers that are on the ground in Gaza, when they have an indifference about our safety, you can have an indifference about the children of Gaza. Maybe you can, because you're not from that part of the world.
But
you can't.
You'd have to be heartless to just...
I'm speaking to you as what the politicians might think. They might have no care in the world for them.
It's not an Australian issue.
Yeah. But when there's Australians that have died on that piece of ground, then it becomes an Australian issue. And there's been an indifference from our government when it comes to that. And that's very disappointing.
It is.
To see.
And there's been politicizing of this issue. I've heard, the other party saying that this is not an Australian issue. But this is something that involves everyone. This is a humanitarian issue.
Well, actually, I disagree. It actually is an Australian issue because the Australian government has a weapons contract with Albeit Systems, and some of those weapons were actually being displayed by the Israeli Defense Minister only last week. Australian weapons,
yes,
that are being used. So actually, this is a Australian issue, and then we have Australian IDF soldiers returning here,
and it's being very conveniently not spoken about.
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's actually a lot of issues that make Australia quite involved in this.
Very much so.
And there are a lot of things that Australia can do. Yeah. And our government said that we are not a major player in the Middle East, but actually you can be a major player in the Middle East if you feed people. If you give them water, if you feed them, if you stop the killing of the children.
Yes.
That's how you become a major player in the Middle East, because then you're seen as a peacemaker. Yes. And what the Middle East needs right now is peace. That means peace for everybody.
Yes.
And that's what it needs. And Australia has an opportunity to be on the right side of history.
Yes.
So, saying we're not a major player in the Middle East, well, you're choosing not to be a major player in the Middle East. You can be with your actions by being brave.
Yes. So there seems to be a technicality, a loophole which allows our Prime Minister to say that we are not sending weapons to Israel. And that's because the parts are being sent to the US, and then they're being assembled there and then being sent to Israel. So that's the technicality that they are using, which I heard.
But that's still the ICJ ruling is you have to do everything within your means. If you know that these parts are then ending up
100%.
in this genocide, then you have to stop.
Yes. Now, when you're saying about aid, they can help with regards to providing aid. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Many of our community have been donating for the Gaza cause. We ourselves attended a fundraiser together, and now that particular fundraising has reached nearly $1 million. But my question is, you were there. How does the aid get through?
So I mean, look, there's the problem is aid gets through in drips and drabs, but there's a lot of issues with trying to get aid into Gaza because of the blockade. And there's also a lot of issues with the actual borders when it gets in. It's heavily taxed at Rafah.
Yeah.
The Egyptian government tax individual lorries that go in. They tax Palestinians that leave. So if you try and evacuate someone, or someone tries to leave, they have to pay a huge sum of money. So there's a lot of exploitation.
It is. Yeah.
There's a lot of exploitation. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be giving aid, because that's the only lifeline that these people have. What I'm just saying is that they're being exploited from every angle. The Palestinians are being exploited, even from a humanitarian point of view. People are making money off a humanitarian point of view.
When you say people is it not the agents that we are sending?
Well, I mean, look, you've got to be very careful with what charities you give to. You've got to give to charities that are reputable, that have a reputation of doing this, that are very clear and transparent. And also, as well, like I say, there's a lot of governments that tax a lot of this.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much in the West, but in the Middle East they do. And that's what you've got to be wary of. So, unfortunately for these Palestinians, they're being attacked from every angle you can think of. Even their humanitarian aid, people are trying to exploit them for that. That's how desperate the situation is. The grains of rice that they have, they're being exploited for those grains of rice.
It's very sad. So despite these overwhelming challenges, do you see any signs of hope, any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, like I said, because after hardship comes ease. And they've felt not just hardship, they've had hardship for 75 years. Inshallah, they'll have ease soon. And, when we've been there, I've been there twice now, the level of killing, the level of destruction, right? This is not a war anymore. This is something else. And, usually when genocides are committed, usually that spells the beginning of the end. of the people that commit the genocide, because the genocide is a final act of control.
Yes.
It's a final act of a solution to a problem that you can't solve. And when that fails, the whole system that built and led up to this also fails.
Yeah.
So the issue now is how long will this end be, and how bloody will the beginning of the end be?
Yes.
And that's why we have to support them as much as possible.
Definitely.
Yep. So I actually do feel hopeful because of all of the pain and all of the suffering. It's been 2 years. They still keep going. People live in normal. Saw those girls that were killed on Eid, and they wore their Eid clothes, and they had their, they had a little bit of money in their hands. I mean, you imagine living in a war zone and still putting on your best clothes and going out and celebrating Eid.
Opportunity to be happy for the day.
That's the people of Gaza. They love to live, right? They love to live, and that's why I feel like they will, that there is hope at the end of the tunnel, because these people are determined.
Some prominent Muslim scholars throughout the world have issued a fatwa, a religious verdict, that Muslim countries should deploy their armies to help the people of Gaza. I mean, we've waited, we've tried, through humanitarian means, we've waited for the West to do something, sanctions, and the ICC, the ICJ have had their say. After all this, nothing has happened. It seems like the only response to a military response against a defenseless people is a military response.
Yeah. I mean, that is, there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions on how you solve the Middle East conflict. Unfortunately, more bloodshed just begets more bloodshed at this stage. I think what needs to happen is everyone needs to do what they can. If you are a doctor, you provide medical aid. If you've got wealth, you provide wealth. And these governments, they need to be protested and lobbied, and there needs to be accountability at the end of this, because look, this is coming to an end very, very soon.
Yes.
And there will be accountability.
There will be people that should be charged for war crimes.
There will be people that will be charged for war crimes, and those people will be people in this country, will be people in the United Kingdom, will be people in France and in Germany, people and in Israel. People will be indicted for this, and there will be trials and tribunals, because you've got to remember there were still trials being held against Nazis in the 70s. This was 30 years after after it. So,
and the difference is we have a lot of this documented. There is camera footage.
There is so much evidence of what's happened.
Perhaps we've never seen a genocide live streamed.
Yeah, this is a live stream genocide. I mean, when people talk about, a lot of people want to, they talk about this as the only way to fight fire is you've got to fight fire with fire. But, the system itself is falling on its knees. The system itself is crumbling. The system that allows this to happen is eating itself from within. When you have set up things like the ICC and the ICJ, right? Originally, it was set up to persecute African leaders and Middle East leaders. It wasn't set up to go after the West. But now it's beginning to eat itself. These institutions and things like the UN and stuff are beginning to eat themselves from inside out, because people are not able to follow what they initially had put out. And what that essentially means is from the ashes of this will rise a new system, which is needed, because, you look at places like India. India's got 1.4 billion people. It's got one of the largest economies in the world. They don't have a veto. They don't have a seat at the table. But Britain and France do, and I'm British, and Britain and France do.
But should there be a veto?
There shouldn't be a veto, but this is what I mean. The system was set up by the winners.
The winners, very much.
And that's what it is. And, what's happening now is this is a last ditch attempt, and Gaza is the focal point of this, of the control, to control the Middle East, to control the resources that move from east to west, to control the oil. That's what's happening right now. And because of that, we're at a flashpoint in our history where the old system, the post-World War II system, is beginning to collapse, and a new system is beginning to arise, a multipolar world, a world where there's more free trade, where there isn't bullying and sanctioning and this, that, and the other, where actually countries can actually thrive together not have one country thrive
at the expense
of others. And I think that's what's happening. And it's one of those things where it's very obvious when you go on there on the ground in Gaza, and when you see women and children deliberately targeted, that to me shows that they've run out of ideas. When you're only going after women and children, you've run out of ideas of how to do it. It's desperation. That's what I can see. I mean, yes, it is desperate when you see women and children dying and starving, and that is a desperate situation. But the other desperate situation is the other side have no idea of how to win. So they go after killing women and children, starving people, committing mass war crimes, and that's what we witnessed.
I'm going to say something which might be controversial, but Hamas is very much needed for Israel to survive. Imagine a world where there's no Hamas. They have no legitimacy because they are the occupying force, occupying land illegally. So the only card that they can show us is the Hamas, is a terrorist. If there was no Hamas, then what justification do you have for occupying that land, for attacking women and children?
Well, the thing is with with people like Hamas, Hezbollah, all of these things, these are all groups that occurred out of the occupation, out of their lands being occupied. And even before these groups occurred, there was an occupation of those lands, So they're not the problem, they're the symptom to the problem.
Correct.
Right? And what the narrative is we have to go and destroy Gaza because of this, the thing that we actually created ourselves and helped fund. By the way, Bibi Netanyahu helped fund Hamas. So, and this is what I mean about the system crumbling in on itself. It's eating itself from within, because when you have to create things like Hamas in order for your legitimacy to survive, and then, what happens, the monster that you created has bit your hand on October the 7th. And now it's caused so many issues for the Israeli government, because now they're facing cases of genocide. Now they have their leader wanted by the ICC. Now they have multiple countries who are kicking out their ambassadors, freezing trade. But this is, again, it comes back to the system is eating itself from within. When the system is corrupt, it requires corruption to stay alive. But it's a falsehood. And it eats itself, and eventually it will self-crumble. And that's what's happening. And, even if you were to get rid of Hamas tomorrow, there'll be another Hamas 2.0 in 20 years' time, because the root cause of it is the occupation. And unless you address the occupation, and unless you're fair about that, then you're never gonna have peace.
It's pretty much just the US and their allies on one side. And you have the entire world on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, you have this one form of political system, which is we're going to govern by power, and we're going to govern by supremacy, and that's never a way to govern, because no free person is willing to live as a second-class citizen in their own home. No one is willing to live without basic decency and human dignity. Once we get to a stage where we can have human dignity and everybody is equal and there's justice for everybody, no matter their creed, and this goes back to Islamic principles, which is where, when the Islamic world ruled in that part of the world, Christians, Jews, and Muslims were all free to worship freely.
We live side by side. In
Palestine. And,
the Jewish people would have the Muslim neighbors babysit their children.
That's exactly what used to happen. And, they would pray in mosques with the Muslims, and Muslims could pray in synagogues as well. This was something that was happening for hundreds of years prior to the occupation. So, we've already seen a solution to this. We already know what the solution looks like. We already saw what peace and harmony in that part of the world looks like. And, when you go in there and you have people like me and UN workers, and we get treated disrespectfully and we get, intimidated and things like that, when that happens to you, you just look at it and you're going like, you're trying to threaten and intimidate doctors. You know what I mean? We're healers. We're not here for war. We're here to heal sick. And if that's a threat to you, what does that say about your system? If a healer is a threat, and that's why the system, I feel, is gonna eventually cave in on itself.
Dr. Mohammed Mustafa, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
That's all for today, inshallah. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe button and help support independent media. Till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.